1917 was the worst year in Australia's history. Not just the worst year of any war, but the worst year for the inhabitants of this nation. For in that year, out of a population numbering slightly less than 5 million, 22,000 Australians lost their lives in battle and 50,000 were wounded. Bullecourt 1, Bullecourt 2, Messines, Passchendaele. These were the killing fields in France and Belgium. Brigadier Noble, Dr. and Mrs. Chauvel, Colonel Graham Smith of the Chauvel Foundation, the Honourable Murray Thompson MP, other MPs I see present, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As we know, for the past 15 years, Australia's armed forces have been engaged in conflict in the war on terror, principally in Iraq and Afghanistan, and out of a population now of 24 million, some 41 soldiers have been killed in action, 41 too many. But 22,000 in the same year. And what was the gain for all of that? Retirement from Bullecourt, partial success at Messines, and an advance of some 7 to 8 kilometres, that's all, over the whole front at Passchendaele after weeks and weeks of fighting, yet far from the sodden battlefields of France and Belgium. Out in the Negev desert, there was a lightning flash where an advance of just 7 kilometres in less than an hour wrote the name of Beersheba in Australia's military annals. Yet strangely enough, until recently, hardly known by Australians, often neglected in school curricula. Monash, now there's the name, Australia's greatest field commander, Monash University, the Monash Medical Centre, the Monash College, the Monash Freeway, the Sir John Monash Centre to be opened at Villa-Bretonneux next year, the proposal to rename Melbourne Ports, Monash. I looked up the Melway. There are just 7 streets named Chauvel, C-H-A-U-V-E-L. There is a plaque on the west wall of St Paul's Cathedral. There is a sword at Christchurch, South Yarra, yet that wiry horseman Harry Chauvel, a professional soldier as distinct from the great civilian soldier, engineer, lawyer, Sir John Monash, achieved more in 1917 than any other Australian. For in that year he led his desert mounted corps over hundreds of kilometres of desert to capture the town of Beersheba, occupied for the previous 400 years by the Ottoman Caliphate. Beersheba, where Abraham had dug a well, where his son Isaac had redug that well. You can read the story in Genesis chapter 26. Beersheba, where horsemen from the world's newest nation, or in Churchill's more colourful phrase, from the uttermost parts of the earth, rolled back the forces of that Ottoman Caliphate, and sending them flying north to Damascus to defeat and to the ultimate abolition of that caliphate in 1924 under the great Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Who were these horsemen? Well, as you know, they were the 5 brigades of mounted infantry, the Australian Light Horse, divided into 15 regiments, each regiment divided into 3 squadrons, each squadron into 4 troops, each troop into 10 sections, each section consisting of 4 horses and 4 men. 3 men to do the fighting on foot, 1 man to handle the horses, bring them forward for later advance or withdrawal. Their standard equipment, that of the infantry. .303 short magazine Lee Enfield rifle, single shot bolt action, and attached to the bayonet boss at the muzzle, the standard 18-inch bayonet, used by diggers all through the First World War, the Second World War, even Korea. There are no doubt some people here who trained on that rifle as their first rifle, as I did. Now, these sections ranged the desert far and wide, spying out the land, through the enemy lines, sometimes behind them, resembling perhaps the children of Israel under Moses and Joshua in these very parts. They were in fact the SAS of the First World War, and on the 31st of October 1917 they rewrote history. Not that they'd been idle up to that point, far from it. They had played a crucial role under Chauvel's leadership in the successful defensive battle at Romani. They'd fought with the British at Katia, Magdaba, Rafah. They'd even temporarily captured the town of Gaza on the sea coast with a storming entry from the rear until ordered to retire by an out-of-touch higher commander, not Harry Chauvel, which of course necessitated a second battle of Gaza. Equally unsuccessful. Plans were afoot for a third battle when there arrived from the Western Front one of the great warrior commanders of the First World War, General Sir Edmund Allenby, who organised his command into 3 corps. 2 corps basically of infantry and a mounted corps, and he gave this mounted corps to Harry Chauvel, who became the first Australian to command a corps in his own right, promoted Lieutenant General, in fact, before Monash. The corps consisted of 3 divisions: the Anzac Mounted Division, consisting basically of the 1st and 2nd Australian Light Horse Brigades, New Zealand Mounted Rifles, various Scottish regiments of artillery, the Australian Mounted Division, which was the 3rd and 4th Light Horse Brigades, eventually the 5th as well, artillery by courtesy of the Honourable Artillery Company, and a 3rd division of British Cavalry or Yeomanry. There was one brigadier who was heard to say, "Fancy giving the command of the greatest number of mounted troops in history to an Australian." But Chauvel, of course, had the runs on the board, a South African war veteran, and his troops made up the majority of the corps. This third Battle of Gaza was planned on this wise. The Turks were to be persuaded that the main thrust would once again be made on the sea coast at Gaza. But in fact, the decisive blow was to be struck 50 kilometres away to the southeast in the Negev Desert at Beersheba, a classic right flank hook, if you like. Now, there were 2 preliminaries necessary for this. First of all, a long, exhausting night march through waterless terrain, and the reduction of a strong point to the east of Beersheba, a place called Tel El Saba, which took the New Zealanders and the Australians who neutralised it a very long period of time. In fact, it wasn't neutralised till well into the afternoon, rather late in the day, to take on the main target of Beersheba. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, with the westering sun sinking into the heat haze, when 800 horsemen from the 4th Australian Light Horse Regiment from Victoria and the 12th Australian Light Horse Regiment from New South Wales halted just 6.5 kilometres from the town of Beersheba, the only object of which was visible was the white smudge of the mosque rising above the haze. Now, these horses had been without water for 30 hours, some of them for more than twice that. Prudence dictated a return to the oases and the wells at Asluj. But Harry Chauvel knew that there were 17 wells in Beersheba. Could they be captured before the enemy engineers blew them up? He came to his decision. "Put Grant straight at it," he said. "Put Grant straight at it." Brigadier General Grant, commanding the 4th Australian Light Horse Brigade, duly relayed Chauvel's orders to Lieutenant Colonel Bouchier of the 4th Light Horse Regiment, to Colonel Cameron of the 12th. "Take Beersheba, capture the wells intact, and take as many Turkish prisoners of war as possible." as a film script was to put it, many years later. The horsemen did not know that what they were ordered to do was impossible. They just obeyed orders. And so the 800 horsemen spaced themselves out in 3 long lines with 300 to 500 yards between the lines, 5 yards between riders, and began the advance at a walk into the trot. And then, as the Turkish artillery and machine gunners opened up, into the canter, and finally into a full and frenzied gallop, the horses catching the excitement, the horses sensing the water in the distant wells, the horsemen yelling and cheering as horsemen have always done, as Australians have always done in the attack. It was the greatest cavalry charge of the war, but they weren't cavalry. They were not dragoons armed with the heavy curved sabre designed to slice off heads and arms from horseback. They were told they could wave their 18-inch bayonets over their head and rely on the thunderous speed of their horses. It was enough. Over the Turkish trenches they leapt, with the Turkish soldiers firing up into the bellies of the horses. Sometimes the same bullet that accounted for the horse accounted for the man. And rounding up, once they'd dismounted with rifle and bayonet, some 700 demoralised Turks, while hundreds of other Turks fled out the exits to the north of the town, and the horsemen from the 12th in particular galloped straight into the wells and found them, mirabile dictu, intact. The engineers hadn't had time to blow them up. And so as the dust and smoke subsided on that battlefield, they laid out their dead. 30 men and 70 horses, with one lad to die of his wounds the next day. He was Trooper Harry Thomas Bell, who had enlisted at the age of 16 under the nom de guerre of Trooper Wickham. These days he'd be a Year 11 student. 31 dead. That's a heavy enough price to pay for less than an hour of fighting, but why were there not more casualties? After all, it was on the 19th of July the year before, at a place called Fromelles, that nearly 2,000 soldiers of the 5th Australian Division had been killed on a single evening. Now, the German and Turkish commanders were well acquainted with light horse tactics, the mounted approach, then the dismounting, fighting forward with rifle and bayonet as infantry. But these horsemen came on, they didn't stop. The rapidity of the advance no doubt unnerved the Turkish gunners and riflemen. In fact, some rifles were found later on with the sights unadjusted, still on 2,000 yards range. Either they hadn't got round to it or were too panic-stricken to do something about it. And so many of the projectiles went over the heads of the horsemen. It was, of course, a crucial victory. The way now lay open to Jerusalem, which duly fell on the 9th of December 1917. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, home of Judaism, occupied then by the forces of Islam, entered now by the armies of a Christian imperium whose leader humbly refrained from warhorse triumphalism at his entry, as had another leader 1900 years before him. Of course, there was plenty of heavy fighting to go. Notably, Harry Chauvel and his troops ran into a much more determined enemy in the operations Transjordan, which decided Harry to withdraw them to the West Bank, because he was that sort of commander. He could take a split-second decision, as at Beersheba, but when faced with a major military problem, he was not one, like so many commanders on the Western Front, to throw troops' lives away needlessly. That plaque on the western wall of St. Paul's Cathedral speaks of his Christian regard for his soldiers in peace and war. Something, of course, he'd always shown as a professional soldier, as the Australian representative on the Imperial General Staff in London in 1914. inspecting the accommodation being prepared for the ANZAC, whose convoy had left, as we know, from Albany on the 1st of November 1914, and Harry was appalled at the prospect of soldiers from the warmer countries of the world being quartered on Salisbury Plain in huts that hadn't even been finished on that bleak Wiltshire upland, and decided he had to make a very strong case, which he did, to the one man in England, I'm quoting Charles Bean there, the one man in England who could get through to Lord Kitchener, Kay, the most famous soldier in the British Empire, who was running the war pretty well single-handedly out of his office in Whitehall. That one man was Sir George Reid, former Prime Minister of Australia, High Commissioner in London, who, I'm quoting Bean again, under his camouflage of genial buffoonery, he was, after all, an old boy of Scotch college, managed to get through to Kitchener, who telegraphed the convoy in the high seas, ordered the troops to disembark in Egypt, a much kindlier climate for the Australian soldiers, although, of course, it placed them in the box seat for the attack on Gallipoli the next year. Mentioning Gallipoli, sometimes it's not known what Chauvel did, although it has been mentioned here tonight. Initially, the light horse were left out of battle, but after the disastrous casualties of the landing, they were called forward as infantry, and Chauvel found himself organising the defences on the crucial left section at Anzac, comprising the Pope's Hill area, Quinns, Courtney, Steele's post, which he did with what Bean describes as conspicuous coolness. He was a bit of a stickler for formalities, was Harry. There are pictures of him on Gallipoli with his hat firmly set in his head and his tie done up in all that blistering heat. But to return to the Middle East front, a series of operations around Megiddo Hill, not exactly on Megiddo Hill. Allenby rather liked the biblical connotations of Armageddon, Revelation chapter 16. Saw Harry redeploying two of his divisions secretly by night, once again to catch the Turks by surprise. May I quote the relevant stanza from a great ode written by Rudyard Kipling for the dedication of the Melbourne Shrine of Remembrance in 1934. Because of horsemen gathered apart and hid, merciless riders whom Megiddo sent forth when the outflanking hour struck, and bid them close and bar the drove roads to the north. You know, that's a very fine poem. I wish it were better known. Pardon the digression, but look, here's Rudyard Kipling describing how the AIF was raised with those men marching in, drifting in from all the country hamlets, the bushland towns, the city suburbs. Thronging, writes Kipling, thronging as cities throng to watch a game. He knew his Australians, Kipling. Thronging as cities throng to watch a game, or their own herds move southward with the year. Secretly, swiftly, from their ports they came, so that before half earth had heard their name, half earth had learned to speak of them with fear, because of certain men who strove to reach through the red surf, the crest no man might hold, and gave their name forever to a beach, which shall outlive Troy's tale when time is old, because of horsemen gathered apart and hid, merciless riders whom Megiddo sent forth when the outflanking hour struck, and bid them close and bar the drove roads to the north. There followed one of the fastest pursuits in modern warfare, 167 kilometres and 3 days, with the Australian mounted troops riding over those Golan heights which separate modern Syria from modern Israel and which provide probably the best artillery observation post in the Middle East, which is why the Israeli Defence Force, which captured them 50 years ago this year in the Six-Day War, will probably never give them up. And so on to Damascus. And we've heard of the contretemps there with T.E. Lawrence already this evening. And then the further 300-kilometre ride on to Aleppo, and that really was the end. And with the Ottoman Empire surrendering in that last week of October, exactly 1 year after Beersheba, 11 days before the guns fell silent on the Western Front. After Beersheba then, the Turks really never stopped retreating, with the light horsemen dogging their heels all the way, carried forward on those sturdy Australian-bred whalers, as we've heard from Phil earlier on, paving the way, in fact, for the establishment just 30 years later of the modern state of Israel and the lands of their forefather Abraham. Israel, which to this day is the only democracy in the Middle East. Now, there is a marked religious dimension to this campaign, unlike many others in that war. It wasn't just the biblical associations of the Holy Land, or the fact that the Ottoman Caliph had, as early as November 1914, declared jihad against the enemies of Allah, but that the Anzacs themselves, most of whom had been to Sunday school, people went to Sunday school in those days, knew the names as they passed through, wrote home about them. The padres, of course, were ecstatic as they fossicked here and there in one biblical village after another. And this, of course, was particularly true of their commander, Harry Chauvel. Chauvel, of course, is a French name, a Huguenot name like that of Charles La Trobe. The Huguenots, that Bible-reading Protestant organisation or church who fled from persecution on the continent of Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Certainly, Chauvel had his Bible with him in his saddlebags, encased in wooden boards for protection. This is the same Harry Chauvel who later became a lay canon of St Paul's Cathedral, hence that plaque, who was for 25 years church warden at Christ Church, South Yarra, to which he bequeathed his sword, which was rededicated just a couple of weeks ago in a very moving evensong service at Christ Church, South Yarra. The same Harry Chauvel who in 1938, having led the Anzac Day parade for many years, resigned from his leadership on principle because the RSL had decided to substitute a secular order of service for the traditional Christian order of service. So Harry Chauvel, GCMG, KCB. I see some younger people in the audience, not perhaps familiar with those imperial wards. KCB, Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, a very high knighthood. MG stands for the Order of St Michael and St George, 3 grades. Harry had them all. He was appointed CMG, that is, Companion of the Order of St Michael and St George, for his services leading the Queensland Mounted Infantry in the Boer War. And then that was elevated to KCMG, Knight Commander of the Order of St Michael and St George, and finally GCMG, Knight Grand Cross, GC, and the Order of St Michael and St George. Some of the wittier sublins in the officers' messes used to interpret them as CMG, call me God, KCMG, the King calls me God, GCMG, God calls me God, but I doubt that Harry had any truck with such irreverence. Well, that was the generation of 1914, 1918, specifically 1917, when horsemen from the world's newest nation rode into immortality and rolled back 3,000 years of history. To no other generation of Australians, I'm thinking of the men of 1914, 1918, to no other generation of Australians, whether, in my view, whether we're talking about 65,000 years of undocumented history or just the 229 years documented in the English language, to no other generation of Australians has so much been owed by so many for such suffering. A word about that owing. There will come a time shortly when these wonderful centenary commemorations will come to an end, certainly on the 11th of November next year. Will the Anzac legacy then fade into the partial oblivion which characterised it in 1970s, 1980s? I recall a textbook approved for study in Victorian schools at that time, written by a geography teacher, I fancy, which categorised the various kinds of employment. Soldiers and police came under the category of harm workers. Can we foresee a time when statuary will be routinely defaced, as happened on occasion to the Boer War obelisk down there in Albert Road? But this is where Anzac Day is such a significant day, the most important day from my point of view in the Australian calendar, more so than the 26th of January, which we know has already been consigned to oblivion by some of the more politically correct councils in Melbourne. This is where Anzac Day comes in, the importance of commemoration. It needs to be impressed on every successive generation of Australians what is in fact owed. If we are to deserve the reputation given to us by our Prime Minister as the most successful multicultural nation on earth, one hopes with equal emphasis on the word nation as on the word multicultural. Sometimes the noun gets subjugated by the more colourful adjective. But if we are to deserve that reputation, then we have to impinge upon the generations coming up. We have to point out that our freedom was bought with a price, not something to be taken for granted, something to be discovered anew in every generation. All of us owe our democratic way of life, our freedom to become the best selves that we want to be, to the sacrifices of the World War generations who laid down their lives to guarantee it. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. The words of Jesus Christ inscribed on that stone at the heart of the Melbourne Shrine of Remembrance, and Melburnians know how that shaft of light illuminates the word love precisely at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. That attribution of greater love could be applied also to Harry's horses, those wonderful whalers, all of whom were denied re-entry to Australia. There was one exception, denied re-entry to the lands, the farms and the districts where they were bred. As for the men, I'll leave the last words to Rudyard Kipling's great ode, pronounced for the first time here in Melbourne. Then they returned to their desired land, the kindly cities and plains where they were bred, having revealed their nation in earth's sight so long as sacrifice and honour stand, and their own sun at the hushed hour shall light the shrine of these their dead.